Grace to you and peace from God our Creator and Christ our Redeemer. Please be seated. It was just over 2 years ago when this new COVID-19 virus caused us to suspend in-person worship for the first time. At the time, I was serving in my last parish, and as we gathered for the very first time over Zoom for our Sunday worship, I remember saying that we didn't expect this to last very long, maybe just a few weeks at the most, until it blew over and we could come back together again. I remember I bought a small camera so that we could have a video in the sanctuary, and I recall being worried that I was wasting money on a frivolous purchase that we wouldn't need in a month's time. And I didn't think I was feeling optimistic either. It was the same message our bishops were giving us, the same message we were hearing from government leaders and medical experts. Surely we'd be back in the pews, back in school, back to our regular lives by Holy Week and Easter. After all, a global pandemic just wasn't a part of our lived reality. Pandemics were things of history and story. They made for great movies and harrowing tales of days long past before the miracles of modernity. But a virus that could bring our world to a grinding halt, that sort of thing just didn't happen. It can't be. It can't be. I wonder how many times the disciples asked themselves that question as they followed Jesus. It wasn't just the miracles, changing water into wine, healing the sick, casting out evil spirits, raising Lazarus from the dead, though those things were indeed unlike anything they had ever seen and strained their credulity. It was everything else that Jesus did. It was everything that he taught and called them to do themselves. Everything that Jesus was refused to fit into the world as the disciples had known it. Everything that Jesus was pointing to was a different reality, a reality that was entirely unlike the world as they knew it. Everything about Jesus was a break with the world as it had always been. Everything about Jesus was new. It can't be. And yet, against all odds, the disciples found themselves coming to believe. It can't be. And yet, could they not see the new creation shining through him? There is a period in that time, in the moments, in the hours, and the days after the death of a loved one, when our hearts and our minds reject their passing, when we look up and a part of us expects to see them standing there, when our eyes sweep the room as we enter, a part of us is surprised to not see them sitting in their favorite spot. We want to reach out to share a story from our day, and we keep weeping anew as we remember that they are no longer there to share it with. It can't be that they are no longer with us. It can't be. So for a time, we keep expecting to find them just around the next corner. The disciples, the women, the men who had followed Jesus for so long were in shock. Everything had happened so fast. Hadn't they just been breaking bread with him in the upper room? And then the betrayal, the midnight raid in the garden as the authorities swept Jesus up and carried him away. The trial was a blur, the waiting and the listening, trying to catch word of what was happening. And then he was dead. All they had now were their regrets, the things they wished they had done or said rather than the denials and the abandonment that had been their final words and actions. While he was still alive, it can't be that Jesus is dead. Each of them had followed Jesus for so long. Each of them Jesus had called by name in the places where they were from. Jesus had opened their minds and unstopped each of their hearts that they might touch and feel and know and understand who he was and what he was doing. and they believed. The disciples had followed him from many different places because in Jesus they saw the impossible promise being fulfilled. In Jesus they saw and understood the new creation that God was working. But more than followed, the disciples loved Jesus. And now he was gone for them. It could not be. None of it felt real. They hid away in their various places of grief, in despair, and in shame. Perhaps it was all a bad dream. Perhaps when they woke up, Jesus would be there with them to share a meal once again. It still didn't feel real in the early morning as the women went to the tomb to prepare his body. The feel of the ground beneath their feet, the sound of their steps along the path, the weight of the spices in their arms, all felt surreal, lodging in their memories in the way that our senses do in the midst of great grief. Suddenly, they were before the tomb. Suddenly, they find that the stone has already been rolled away. Suddenly, they discover that his body is gone. It can't be. Someone has moved him. Someone has stolen his body. Grief rips through them anew. None of this can be real. Suddenly, two appear before them in dazzling array. Why do you look for the living among the dead? The two ask. Jesus is not here, but has risen. Their words land on the women, but they don't make sense. Jesus is alive. It can't be. My friends, nothing about the resurrection story makes sense. Nothing about it fits into the world as we know it. The other disciples, when they heard the news that these women brought of the empty tomb and the message of the strangers, could not believe it. And we, like them, struggle to understand the strange witness of these women. We, like them, struggle to accept the words of these unknown figures in dazzling array. It can't be. And yet, it cannot be. And yet the testimony of the women is true. The tomb is empty. It cannot be. And yet, when we seek Christ among that which is dead, we find that he is not there. It cannot be. And yet, when we look for Jesus, we find that he is risen, for we meet him face to face. Do not fault the first disciples for their disbelief in the face of the resurrection, just as I do not fault ourselves for our own incredulity when confronted by the resurrection. Because I think that is the only human response that is possible. For what other response is there but shock and astonishment and disbelief when we at last come face to face with the fulfillment of the audacious promise of a scandalous God? It can't be, we cry. And yet, I am, says the risen Christ. Nothing can ever be the same now, for Christ is risen. The world is turned on its head, and the powerful have been made low, and the poor and the downtrodden are being comforted and filled, for Jesus lives. The old things are passing away, and the new creation is here and now and in our midst, for the tomb is empty. It can't be. And yet, Christ is risen. Alleluia, alleluia.